Update of the morning. Hello, welcome to this carrier update brought to you by Powerfleet. I'm here with the Sultan of Sonar. He makes his return. Ladies and gentlemen, Zach Strickland. Zach, welcome back.
Yeah, back from the road. Glad to be here. Much calmer here in the office than the chaos of the outside world. But the chaos continues for the freight market. I mean, most people, I think, at this point have read the Freightways.com article talking about the bloodbath and everything going on. Well, the tender rejection rate continues to support that thesis that we are actually in that transitional period where the market is taking a severe downturn. Tender rejection rates down below 13% the last 2 days. 12.51% on the outbound tender rejection index today, and it looks like this is an accelerating pattern. So, we can't necessarily see the underlying reasons in terms of which freight is dropping off, but I think it's safe to say that some of that consumer demand has a lot to do with this because that is the reason that we were in this cycle to begin with. The industrial sector still kind of cranking along, but it's just not filling the gaps as we see some of that consumer activity start to wane. And we talked about the inventories being what they are. A lot of that stuff is being held upstream, so there's still a lot of potential. This may be short-lived, we don't know. But for now, for the time being, all we have is the real-time trend here. Tender rejection rates, I mean, Anthony, it's almost like overnight. the faucet turned off. March 6th is the date that will live in infamy in terms of the freight market turning this year. Up around 17, 18% at that point, and then it just dropped. I mean, you can see the trend line here. I didn't pull it all the way back because it's not necessarily relevant anymore. I think everybody knows that it was super tight last year, but this point of inflection right here about March 6th, you can see it was almost like just overnight the faucet turns off.
I mean, Zach, when we're looking at this, I think the next thought is, okay, where's this new baseline going to reach? Where is that new low going to be? And after we get there, one of the other questions that a lot of folks are kind of bringing up are people just getting more efficient? And when I think about more efficiency, this does not kind of equate to such a large drop-off, but that's also a slight, maybe smaller impact as well, potentially?
Yeah, I think but it's small. I think it would be small. What it really took, what it had to have taken, if you look at your consumer demand figures, is some sort of easing on the demand side. There's capacity was simply not going to grow to the extent that we've seen here. And, if you read some of those articles on Freightways.com about the current market, a lot of the fleet count expansion is happening in the smaller fleets. So you have this attrition rate. We had a lot of larger carriers sell off their equipment in the third and fourth quarter last year because they could take advantage of that top of the market. They weren't growing their fleet size by any strong amount. It wasn't simply that because they couldn't get the trucks.
Right.
And then it was going to take 6 to 9 months to a year to even get those orders fulfilled. So it didn't make a lot of sense to start just growing your fleet and trying to gain that market share, that necessarily may not have been there. And now we're seeing, here's the reason why. You don't really want to start growing at some sort of exponential figure to match the market because demand side easing is what it was going to have to take to move us through this. So speaking of demand, let's look at the next chart. The outbound tender volume index paired with the outbound tender rejection index, because the portion of the outbound tender volume index is comprised of those rejected tenders. So it's important to see both of them on the same chart a little bit here. But you can see the tender rejection rate's actually dropping faster than the tender volume index. That's because the accepted tender volumes are about flat with where they were last year, which is something that I don't think a lot of people understand. So what we're seeing is there's more stuff being covered under their contracts, as is indicated by the tender rejection index, and the fact that the spot market volumes are probably shrinking at a pretty strong pace. I think probably on par with this. If we look at our truckstop.com, top 100, they move almost exactly in sync with our tender rejection index over the last month or two. So it's, the spot rates, obviously dependent on that volume and the capacity shrinking, it's definitely going away at this point in time. But tender volumes, I mean, these carriers are carrying as much under contract as they were this time last year, but the missing part of that equation is how much are they covering on the spot market right now? Answer to that is probably a lot less.
Yeah, Zach, and the other question I'm always asking is how is this going to impact carriers, smaller fleets versus the larger fleets, especially new entrants that have never really been through a potential downturn like this before?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the smaller fleets feel this type of market inflection more than the larger ones. If you look at some of our, the earnings reports, Knight-Swift, 78.5 OR. So they're making 21% margins on their freight, but they also were stockpiling cash over the last couple of months. So they're ready for these downturns. They have some room, some buffer. Now, some of these smaller guys that bought their trucks at $150,000, 3-year used models, twice the rate, they now have to pay that off. It is just not it's not the same game when you're talking about that scale that some of these larger fleets have. So the smaller guys definitely feel this more. They have a higher fixed cost threshold to overcome, and they definitely have to really skirt by without spot market volumes.
Yeah, Zach, that is rough, especially for those smaller and newer entrants into the market. Thank you so much for this update. We'll check in with you again throughout the morning. Right now, we're going to toss it over to Tony Mulvey, who has our first guest of the morning.